Hey everybody, it's Joe from Gadgetry Tech. Today's video is going to be about the Yamaha R-N800A. This is a network amplifier receiver, I guess, and it's the middle sibling of three new models that were announced in fall of last year. So the less expensive 600 series is $900. This guy is $1,200, and then the more expensive top dog model is the 1000 series, and that sells for $1,800. Now, the community growth for this channel and the feedback and comments that I've seen from you all has been incredible. I cannot thank you enough, and if you want to be part of that and you're not already, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button if you like the content, of course, because I'd love to see it the next video. Now, the most affordable 600 series still has some good features. It's not as powerful as this or the 1000 series, but it is still a network-capable receiver amplifier, so when I get into that portion of this video and I start talking about the app and how easy it is to use, that translates to all three models. Now, the 600 series still uses an ESS DAC inside, but it does not have a USB-B terminal in the back. It does still have a subwoofer output, however, and it does still have a Phono Preamp along with optical and coaxial input. So you still have some good flexibility there in addition to being just a network amplifier. So if you don't need the extra power that the 800 or the 1000 series brings you, and you don't care about the room calibration features, it's still not a bad option. Now, taking apart the N800A reveals a few things. One, there's a robust power supply. I mean, the thing is huge, it radiates some heat, but that's how it's getting some of that power output that this is capable of delivering. It also has two very large heat sinks, which again, when you have that kind of wattage output, being passively cooled, you need a large heat sink to keep that in check. The transistors will perform better. They even have little foam guides on the edge of the heat sink. So if you are tinkering around in there or you reach inside, they're literally there just to prevent you from scratching yourself. Now, the I/O panels for your line in, your Bluetooth, your AM/FM antenna, coax, all of that, they're actually on a separate board as well. And I think that helps with serviceability. It could also help with EMI interference, I'm not sure, but at least they have certain things broken down by their stage or what they do as far as the amp and DAC functionality goes. Overall, it's a pretty clean design. Now, the N800A has just a ridiculous amount of connectivity, which for a nerd like me is great because I tend to run more cables than I need half the time just so they're all, wired and ready to go. So you have the USB-B DAC, you have two coax, two optical, you have two standard line in, a CD input, phono with ground, a subwoofer output, which is awesome and to me very important for systems like this. Obviously the two speaker terminals and then the USB-B DAC to connect to a laptop. It even has a pre-out as well, so if you want to use this as a switching device, you can use that, and whatever input you select, it's going to send out your pre-out. Now, this next part's going to be a little bit alphabet soup, and the 800 series and 1000 series adds a feature called YPAO RSC. This is something special from Yamaha. It stands for Yamaha Parametric Room Acoustic Optimizer, and the RSC is reflected sound control. So what this does, the way this works, is it comes with a microphone, a very long cord. Hopefully it makes it to where your listening position is, but you plug it into the front of the amplifier and then it prompts you via the nice little OLED screen on the bottom to start the process. You basically place the mic in your primary listening position. If you have a subwoofer, make sure your subwoofer is connected. Set your volume to 50% and maximize or max out your filter so you're not filtering out higher frequencies on the sub. Either disable it or set it to 200 plus hertz. Doing so runs a series of tones and snap sounds and things like that because it's measuring reflections in your room. It's also measuring frequency response, what this microphone picks up for sound, delay of sound, phasing, all of this good stuff. It's not a moving mic method. It's a single point. So I've used Yamaha, and this is just for this series. I'm sure that on some of the higher end Yamaha systems, maybe there's a moving mic method where you do several measurements in different spots. I know Denon's Odyssey or Denon, Odyssey XT, that has a moving mic method and it takes a much longer period of time. However, the results still aren't bad. Now, what's cool is you can turn it on and off and it saves the profile. So some people may like or may dislike the results, and that just comes down to personal preference. I like certain things about it. So on the subjective side, the imaging does appear more cohesive. It seems, I always try to explain listening to where if you can close your eyes, how much can you pinpoint the source of the sound? Do the speakers have a very clear left and right? Is there a nice blurred holographic presentation? I don't want to get into audiophile buzzwords because I'm really not trying to go down that path where we start talking about these fancy terms or whatever, but I can tell you that once the calibration is done, if I close my eyes, it is harder to discern the point of audio. And I think they achieved that well. Now, as far as the frequency response goes, I didn't totally agree with the output. So there are times where I would prefer to do my own manual calibration. Not many people are going to have a microphone that's calibrated where they can measure in-room reflections and do their own DSP through a mini DSP or something that gives you more control. As far as just plugging in and going with YPAO off or disabled, not run, the bass performance is much stronger. Once you run this, it flattens out the bass quite a bit. Some people will just not like that right off the bat because people like bass. It also does affect your treble delivery, and depending on your speakers, I found that there's a little bit of a suck out in the mids. I felt like the mids weren't as forward in the mix. It sounded a little bit thinner and stepped back. Could have been due to the presentation of the soundstage and imaging, but again, certain tracks I liked the vocal performance better with YPAO off. All right, now to provide a comparable measurement to the amplifier, this is what my room measured using an SVS PB2000 subwoofer and two Bowers & Wilkins S606 S2 speakers. This isn't indicative of how the sub performs or how the speakers perform. It's how they both perform with the position they are in my room. The room makes a massive difference on how anything performs. You can have very inexpensive speakers sound much better than much more expensive speakers if they're positioned right and the room treatment is right. So this frequency response is not great, but it's not terrible. There are some room reflections and nodes impacting bass delivery and causing some gaps in what I expect to hear. But again, I just want to show you how the room measures. Now, if I enable YPAO and I have the subwoofer on, the green line represents the calibrated output of the 800A. There are a few things that I like. One, it does smooth out the bass. It was very obvious that in that current setup, there was just way too much bass. It was very forward, boomy, bloated sounding, and it negatively hurt the mix. So if I were not using YPAO, I would have turned down my sub volume further and applied some DSP there. But just with a traditional overlap that a lot of people do, setting the sub to, let's say 50 to 80 hertz and having your speakers take care of the rest, this is the byproduct of that. Now, again, this is one single point of measurement, so this isn't fully accurate, but it does highlight some of the things that YPAO was doing. You can see a dip around 1K, and this was an average of measurements. I took multiple measurements here, and then, because I actually took a lot more than what's pictured, I just deleted some. That suck out I was talking about, this could have been to combat room reflections or other issues that amplifying this signal more would have caused. So this is just exposing what it's changing. That 2.5K I think explains some of the suck out I was having on some of my voices, just sounding a little bit further back. But you can see that the treble delivery was filled in to be more even, which is what's affecting your soundstage. So if some people hear that this amplifier with YPAO on sounds more vast and sparkly and clear, that's because of the treble lift that overall it gains. Now there's one little, spike that shifted slightly, just in a series of few measurements here, but as a whole, upper frequencies have been lifted. Now it's really cool. If I turn this off and then you look at the measurement of YPO on with the subwoofer off, this is the low end fill that my sub was assisting with before that's now gone because the S606 doesn't really have any strong bass performance under 50 hertz. It's a smaller bookshelf speaker. Now enabling the subwoofer again, but leaving YPAO on, I did some SVS sub parametric EQ to fill the null a little bit. And when you compare it to the average measurement, you can see this dip right about 40 hertz is filled in a little bit more. So you can do some fine tuning depending on the subwoofers you have. And I'm not trying to do this to say this is the exact byproduct of every room calibration because it's unique to you. But there were some things to like about it. The Cambridge DAC measured very similarly. This is using my Cambridge DAC Magic 200M with YPAO on. And just looking at the two frequency responses, if I make sure everything else is off, which I did, it's nearly identical. It's within the margin of error. Now, subjectively, the DAC Magic has a little bit more attack to it. It seems a little bit more snappy and musical sounding, if you will, whereas the ESS DAC that's built into this is a little bit cleaner. I guess it's It's less dynamic in the higher frequencies, but overall it's a very neutral, clean presentation. So you might prefer one over the other. The DAC Magic from Cambridge is just a little bit more energetic and snappy. Now I want to talk about the remote real quick because I love this remote. And this reminds me of a more old-fashioned remote. This is all plastic, by the way. The 1000 series, I believe, upgrades to a metal remote to be a little bit more robust. But I don't really care if it's plastic or metal if it works well. It's a long remote and there's tons of buttons. Now what I like about it is this whole top part is all of your inputs. And instead of hitting input up, input down, because you got to keep in mind, this is a smaller screen. It's not like I'm seeing the change on a television. There's no video output. So knowing that I have a very quick and easy to access button layout on the remote just makes the quality of life easier. I don't need an aesthetically pleasing remote that's clean and futuristic. I just want to listen to music, and this makes my life easier. You also have speaker A and B control because there are two sets of outputs on the back for different speakers. You can also, this is another huge feature, I was talking about YPAO earlier, you can enable or disable YPAO on each individual speaker output. So you can have one with YPAO on versus off. I really like that feature. Now, when you go to the bottom here, you have some presets that you can custom set up, I guess, for your AM, FM. It does have an AM tuner, and it comes with a nice simple FM wire for that. Navigation buttons, up, down, left, right. This is basically what you're going to use during the setup process. Home and return and setup option. These are fairly self-explanatory, and if you hit now playing, instead of just saying title, it can scroll the song or track that's playing from the network on the screen. Volume and mute is self-explanatory. Now this part's really cool. The repeat, shuffle, forward, back. If you are using the app to control your music and play tracks and whatnot, this can also change the tracks from the network side. You don't only have to exclusively use the app. So if you load up a track or a playlist that you like on your phone, and then you're on a phone call and you don't like what's playing in the background, or maybe you're doing something else on your phone, you can then use the remote to kind of take over and go through the queue. So yes, it is a very busy looking remote, but once you get used to the layout, I would much rather have a remote that gives me all of this stuff built in rather than just change source, turn the volume up and down, and maybe mute or toggle the power. I love this approach, so I really want to commend Yamaha for sticking to something that I think a lot of people grew up liking and using every day. All right, so now I want to talk about the Yamaha MusicCast app, because frankly, I don't care if a product is $300 or $5,000. If it's a network streamer and the app doesn't work well, what is the point? Now this has excellent specs. The power output is absurdly high on the 800 and 1000 series. Even the 600, it still has more than enough power for what most people will use in their home. However, again, if those specs are excellent but the app doesn't work, I'm not really going to use the product as much, or I'll still be frustrated by it. And thankfully, the MusicCast app is excellent. Now, I don't own every single network player out there. I've used Hi-Fi Rose in the past, which I got mine when it first came out. It's a South Korean product, and that streamer alone is a few $1,000s with no amplification. And then I've used things like the PS Audio Stellar Strata, which I still use. I actually bought that after my review because I like the way that amp performs. And I'll compare it to this later because that amp is $3,000, and it's good to see how this stacks up to something that pricey. I also have the Cambridge Audio MXN10 streamer. It's a $500 network streamer that plugs into every device. So I've used a few different apps. This is extremely easy to use. Not only is the interface fairly clean, it's limiting to an extent of calibration or customization, but as far as all of your sources go, there's internet radio. Just like I could with the remote control, I can select every input on the app once I select this device. You can create rooms, so if you have multiple network streamers from Yamaha, you can play the same music with all of it. The casting feature works great. So what I end up doing, my personal preference is to load something like Tidal and then choose the Tidal Connect option and cast directly to the N800. Now, once this takes over, again, as I mentioned earlier, I can use the remote to change tracks. I also love that if you have multiple smart devices connected to the same app and network, they sync perfectly. I can change tracks on either my mobile phone or my tablet, and both of them will immediately change and sync with each other. There's no weird mismatch, which is great if you're having a party and you have multiple people playing with the amp. It's not going to cause any issues. Now I kind of torture tested this. I use the Wi-Fi connection and I use Ethernet. Wi-Fi setup is a breeze as well. A lot of this stuff can be done with the remote, and the quick start guide will tell you how to set it up. So I prefer that method because when you use a direct streaming option, it's much better sounding than using AirPlay or Bluetooth. You don't have the same compression issues and you get closer to true source. So use that when you can, and then have the application or the app, I guess, to customize it. You can adjust the volume control and that syncs up against apps really well, or multiple apps really well. And you can even enable or disable YPAO. So it's robust enough, and I never had an issue where it just lost what I was playing. It's probably one of the best performing streaming apps I've used. And even though I love my Denon amps and receivers, no offense to Denon, but your app's not that great. I am not a huge fan of how HEOS works compared to something like this. It's kind of a game changer to me, and I think it's important to call that out. Now, I showed in-room response measurements before using YPAO, turning it on and off, subwoofer none, and how that affects your sound quality. But I do want to talk about this performance from a subjective standpoint. You know, what I hear and what I like when I'm sitting on my couch in front of my speakers. Now, I have a lot of different amps and sources on 2-channel. I've used some pretty expensive stuff, and I've had very high-end speakers set up with this application. Now, when I compare it to other products I have several Denon amps for like the home theater side. I use the 4700 in a couple rooms, for example. And that does not have the same audio performance when it comes to music as my integrated and 2-channel amplifiers. I try to switch both thanks to the use of banana plugs. I run multiple speaker cables and I hop back and forth. The amps that I've used in the past that I really like on the integrated side is from Vincent Audio and from PS Audio, which are comparably priced, if not more expensive than this. I thought, because I make presumptions, we all have a bias. You know, you have a certain product, you see a certain spec sheet, and you make an assumption about how you think it's going to perform. That's human nature, and I had a little bit of bias going in just because when I see a Yamaha amp, I think of less expensive Yamaha receivers, which, you know, under $1,000, they're not going to compete with a high-end musical amp. In my opinion, this is again just based off stuff I've heard. This blew me away. The power delivery is so much better than a traditional receiver's sound output that I've heard. I was quite shocked. The bass impact is excellent. It's very, very tight and clean sound. I know some of it could be a byproduct of the ES DAC. However, compared to the other amps, so my Vincent Audio amp is a little bit less resolving, but it's like a warmer, more sultry, thicker presentation. It's great for vinyls. Now, when you switch over to the PS Audio amp, the PS Audio Stellar Strata is a powerhouse for how compact it is. It's really misleading, and it's about as heavy as this, even though it's half the height. I was surprised at how close the Strata sounded to this. Now, they both use ES DACs, so that could be part of it. They have, some DACs have their own coloration or lack thereof to the sound. And the ES is very clinical and neutral sounding. It doesn't really have any color to the mix. But the upgraded power delivery of the N800, it was really shocking at how well it kept up with busy tracks, bass demanding tracks. Now, I've used Alta Audio speakers, I have Martin Logan's, I have Bowers & Wilkins, and I have Kef. And I move the amp from different rooms, thanks in part, again, to the whole banana clip situation. It makes it easier for me to test different things. And this thing just keeps delivering. I love how it comes out of the box. YPAO is going to be a subjective thing. But the robustness of power when you step up to the 800 becomes apparent, because that extra wattage means that when you're not pushing it, it typically has less distortion. The amp isn't working as hard. And I think that over-spec'd power supply is helping, you know, with bass transients. Let's talk about these volume knobs too, because having tone control, bass, treble, balance, loudness, all built in, and then you have a button here for Pure Direct. Even though this remote's super robust, I wish it had a Pure Direct button. That's the only thing I didn't find on it, so man, that would have been sweet. But I guess because it's a push button, maybe it's a physical defeat, and that's why. The other thing I notice is when you do the volume or the bass and treble adjustment, if it's in the neutral position, you're not changing anything, and it does a tone control bypass to almost get close to Pure Direct again. This just overrides YPAO no matter what. But as soon as you turn the bass or treble up or down once, there's a very brief pause where the sound cuts out because now you're enabling tone control. Once one of them is on, if I change treble or bass or whatever it may be, then I don't get any more brief cutout in the audio because I've already enabled tone control. So it's little things like that where Yamaha is trying to give you the best possible musical performance based off the current settings that you have, while also having a really robust hardware package to get the most out of your money. Now, I also used a Phono Preamp with this. I have a Music Hall MMF 3.3 table. It's a dual plinth table with an Ortofon red cartridge, and then I have a Vincent Audio PHO Phono Preamp. I love that combo. It just sounds absolutely incredible. So when I bypassed it, I mean, that preamp alone is half the price of this, just for the Phono Preamp. So when I bypass it and go to this still sounds good. It's going to get the job done and be clean. However, it sounds a little bit more compressed and less resolving. It's kind of like it's functional, but you know, depending on how much you're spending on the turntable, you may want to consider an external Phono Preamp just to get a little bit more out of it. Now, I guess just wrapping up the sound quality side, I never found that using this, thanks to the ability of turning YPAO on and off, and thanks to having a knob for bass and treble, because sometimes a song just needs more bass, or sometimes an old mix needs more or less treble. So having these types of things, these are quality of life things that you don't see on spec sheets really. I guess you can look at a picture and infer it, but having a remote that lets you pick your input, the bass and tone adjustments, and all these things, for how people use their stuff every day, this is so big. And then you back it up by a music app that works and sound quality that frankly works well for everything because it's not coloring the sound. This is a really solid amp. Now, it is built extremely well, but if you want top of the line components, or you are noticing the fact that this does not have HDMI, again, this is typically used on the music side of things, so not having HDMI is pretty common. Now, the 1000 series does add HDMI. It does sacrifice an input to do that, but having the HDMI to connect to a television in case you just have a stereo setup and you occasionally use your speakers for TV watching, that's a good option to consider. It also has, you know, more robust coupling capacitors. It uses gold-plated terminals on the back and a better platform, like a balanced platform that the unit sits on. It's a two-piece design instead of a mono design. So there are improvements to the 1000 series. Power output is basically identical. It's just higher quality components. So you're going to have some of the, I guess, the measurements or real life experience may differ than what the spec sheets suggest. However, I think with the way this is designed and built with that power overhead, I would prefer the 800 over the 600 just for that reason, because if you're spending this much, you might as well get the extra overhead. Maybe you upgrade stuff down the road and you just want to have that, you know, peace of mind. So that kind of wraps up the review, but I think there's some unique things here. This is a crowded space, you know, 2-channel audio, network streaming, amplifiers, etc. There are hundreds or thousands of things you can pick from. This price range is up there. You know, for a lot of people, this is like end game pricing. And obviously there's some ridiculously priced audiophile stuff out there. $1,200 to get this kind of performance with how good the app is, the remote, tone control, quality of life features, immediately puts this kind of at the top for your value, in my opinion, because not only does all that stuff work well and is very thoughtful, but it performs well too. This is the closest amp I have that performs like my Stellar Strata, which is $3,000 than anything else I've owned or used. And it's almost a third of the price. I think that speaks to how well engineered and built this is. That's just my experience, again, using it on the stuff I own. So I've been really happy with it. I'm not saying you have to go out and buy this, but if you've been on the fence, just keep all these little things in mind. If you're looking at competitors, go to the app store of that competitor and see how people think the app works, because that's how you're going to actually use the product. You're not shopping just the spec sheet. Stuff like that, when you look at the total picture, is why I think this is going to be a really hot seller this year, in addition to the sound quality. So thank you so much for watching the review. If you found it helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'd love to see you at the next one. And with that being said, I'll see you next time. Bye.